Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our web debate. This is web debate number 60. And today we meet to discuss the question, why and how should countries engage with tech diplomacy? Tech diplomacy has become somewhat of a buzzword, not least since 2017, since the appointment of the Danish tech ambassador, the first such appointment. At the same time, it's still not quite clear what tech diplomacy actually is. So I hope with this panel and with this discussion today, we can contribute to some more clarity, but also really make a case for the importance of the practice of tech diplomacy and what this actually entails. My name is Katharina Höhne. I'm the Director of Research at DiploFoundation, and I will moderate this debate. We organize these debates once a month in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training, precisely to discuss new and emerging topics and practices in diplomacy. This particular event is also co-organized in partnership with SwissNext in San Francisco and with the Canton of Geneva. I will not say very much about tech diplomacy, what it is, how we could define it, etc., etc. I will leave that to our panel of speakers, which I will introduce now. And I must say already in advance, I'm quite excited to hear from them. And I'm extremely thankful that they had the time to join us today. So I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. So I will start with my dear colleague, Pavlina Ittelsen. She's the Executive Director of Diplo. Then we have Mr. Martin Rauchbauer, who is the former Austrian tech ambassador in Silicon Valley, and he's the founder and co-director of the Tech Diplomacy Network. Next, we have Mr. Yannick Heiniger, who's with the Consulate General of Switzerland in San Francisco, and who has done extensive work in tech diplomacy, not least through the SwissNext network. Then we have Ms. Beatrice Ferrari. She is the Director of International Affairs at the Canton of Geneva, so she will bring this Geneva connection into our discussion. And last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Tatu Morokong. She's the Assistant Director, Africa Multilateral Cooperation at the Department of Science and Innovation in South Africa. Thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. A reminder for our audience. We have an amazing panel. At the same time, we would also like to hear from you and make this discussion as interactive as possible. So please feel free to put your comments and your questions here in the chat on Zoom. My colleague, Anastasia Stent, will keep a close eye on the chat here. A number of other colleagues will monitor the streaming of this event on social media. And then we will bring in all these questions and comments back into this debate for our speakers to respond to and for us to have a discussion. So please don't hold back. We're really keenly interested to hear from you, how you understand tech diplomacy and what you think are the burning questions when it comes to the practice of tech diplomacy. As I said, we have a number of really interesting speakers, practitioners, researchers. So I think it is an urgent time to get into the discussion. And so I would like to start with my colleague, Pavlina Ittelsen. Pavlina is, as I said, the Executive Director of Diplo. She's also the author of a recent study on the practice of tech diplomacy in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this is the most up-to-date study on the practice of tech diplomacy, what different countries are doing in the San Francisco Bay Area that we have so far. And Pavlina, I basically wanted to give you the floor to give us a brief introduction to the study, to your findings, to the kind of understanding of tech diplomacy that you were able to develop through the interviews, through the research you did for this study. Pavlina, over to you.
Thank you, Katharina. And just to complete your introduction, I am happy to say you get 2 for 1 because my co-author Martin Rauchbauer is in the room as well. So you have both sides of the story, and there are certain areas that are still in discussion between us. And that is, first one is, what is tech diplomacy? How do we define it? How does it differ from digital diplomacy, from cyber diplomacy, and the representations which go with it. But to introduce the report, so the first report Diplo did on the practice of tech diplomacy in San Francisco was in 2018. And the second report is meant as an update because certainly many changes have happened in those past years in diplomacy and elsewhere. Three of them, countries are implementing more and more digital foreign policies, and the representation which go with it, including the tech diplomacy outposts, and nominating global digital ambassadors. Companies are more engaged in tech diplomacy due to geopolitical changes, and also greater awareness exists about the benefits of tech diplomacy worldwide and the impacts of digital development on development. In terms of methodology, as you mentioned, we did have 37 practitioners that we interviewed in the course of the research, including workshops and roundtables with both companies and diplomats. And we also did extensive desk research. So combining those two gave us overview on how countries are represented in San Francisco Bay Area, what models do they use, anywhere between from a global digital diplomat to local tech envoy to series of networks which are engaged in tech diplomacy. As we have Yannick in the room, the Swiss model includes SwissNext, and Brazilian model, for example, includes Science Diplomacy Network called SecTech. And I won't take much of the time, but just to give a couple of findings of the report. The practice area has matured. 5 years ago, it was more of on the innovation side. There was a sense of exploration in the relationship between tech diplomats and companies. Now it has shifted more into the policy questions, more into serious questions of human rights and democracy. There is a lack of representation of Global South countries in San Francisco Bay Area specifically. Most of the representations are from Global North and developed countries, which is one of the reasons why we're having this webinar to open the space to discuss tech diplomacy practices elsewhere as well. And the last one, there are still challenges in practicing tech diplomacy, both on the sides of diplomats and the companies. Some of them are cultural, between different stakeholders, between businesses and between the diplomatic community. Some of them are related to the local flair of San Francisco and its way of doing things fast and furious. And some of them are bridged by the personalities of tech diplomats who are engaged in this practice and who are able to basically navigate the cultural and technological and knowledge differences in their practice. But I'll let them speak for themselves now. And if there are any questions about the report, please let me know. I'll link the report in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, we just put the link to the report in the chat for everyone who wants to have a quick look. But Pavlina, thank you so much for the very concise and super interesting overview on the report, and also like your comments on how the practice of tech diplomacy has changed. And as you said, 2 for 1 in this event, or 1 for 2, I'm not sure. Which brings me to the next speaker. And the next speaker is for me also a good reminder to issue another thank you to our speakers, because we have 2 speakers who join us from San Francisco and who are practitioners in San Francisco. But at the moment, it's 6 o'clock in the morning in San Francisco. So thank you so much for joining us, for getting up extra early, for being ready to be on camera at 6 o'clock in the morning. Very much appreciated. But without further ado, I would like to turn to Martin Rauchbauer. And I already introduced him as the former Austrian tech ambassador, tech envoy in Silicon Valley, also the founder of the Tech Diplomacy Network. And as Pavlina also said, he is the co-author of the study. Pavlina already hinted that in this practice, for example, there are different views on how to define tech diplomacy, what actually tech diplomacy is. I'm not going to ask you to define tech diplomacy, Martin, but I would like to ask you from your experience as a practitioner to basically reflect on the practice of tech diplomacy, perhaps how it has changed, how you experienced that in San Francisco. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And also a warm good morning. As you can see from my virtual background, it is early morning in San Francisco here at the Golden Gate Bridge. I've been here in San Francisco since 2016. And what Pavlina correctly described as tech diplomacy in its practice maturing over this large period of time has a lot to do, of course, with the rise and I would say at the moment a little bit crisis of the global tech industry itself, which has many global companies that are here in Silicon Valley. Not all of them, of course, but I think that is also the reason why the study took place in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley. If you think of the last, let's say, 10 years, what really has happened is a dramatic rise of many global tech companies, particularly digital platforms that have not only risen in terms of their revenues and in terms of the technologies that have influenced the world, but they really have also acquired power, power that in some cases rivals the power of some nation states. And therefore are an important factor in international relations. And I think tech diplomacy is in reality a reaction, accompanying reaction by nation states to this phenomenon. And what we have seen over, I would say, the last years, and this is what the report really reflects on. And if you think of it, of course, there were the years of the global pandemic, which infected some tech companies positively. They grew even further, others less so. And I think what the recent months have really showed is also that there is a consolidation going on in the global tech industry, with some companies leaving the Bay Area, other companies shedding important numbers in the workforce. So there's a lot of dynamic changes going on in the tech industry, and the countries have reacted largely by themselves investing in their own structures. I would say some countries have really significantly ramped up their presence globally, but particularly here in Silicon Valley. And this is what the report reflects. Of course, not all countries. And this is also one of the reasons why in February of this year, a number of people, and I was one of them, decided to launch an initiative, the Tech Diplomacy Network, that really has this function to provide a platform for the countries present in Silicon Valley, but also be kind of a contact point for those countries that want to have access to this network and to this practice. And we advise them and we help them to establish themselves.
Thank you so much for painting this really interesting and broad picture. You mentioned crises, you mentioned some actually fundamental changes also on the side of tech companies. Recently, we've seen a lot of calls for regulation, especially when it comes to generative AI. So there's a lot of things happening, and you mentioned the pandemic as kind of a catalyst. But then also basically the recent hype or discussions around generative AI, perhaps also as another point that perhaps necessitates tech diplomacy, but also reshapes how that exactly looks like. I'm just going to put the link to the Tech Diplomacy Network in the chat so people can follow this up. So thank you so much for this overview, Martin. And from there, I basically want to go to someone else who's based in San Francisco and who got up very early in the morning, which is Yannick Heinecke. And you have also a lot of experience practicing tech diplomacy in Silicon Valley, among other things, through SwissNext, this really interesting construct that Switzerland came up with when it comes to science and technology. So basically the same kind of question for you. You practice tech diplomacy in San Francisco. How does it look like for you? What kind of experiences would you share from your perspective?
I'll say that at the end of the day, the definition about what is and what is not technology diplomacy when it comes to the practice matters a bit less. What is important to realize is that at the moment, there is a growing sense of we have to talk to each other. And it's not just about government. It's not just about the private sector. You have NGOs, you have international organizations. You have, of course, what's happening within universities in the Bay Area. And the environment in which we operate, the way it becomes so complex with the geopolitics coming into play, is really bringing somehow people to align, to realize that they need to talk to new people, they need to diversify their business of stakeholders. And that's really a change for people like us who are in the Bay Area to talk to as many people as we can, not just to create dialogues, but to drive systemic action together. And as Martin said, you have many different models that exist. You have forums that have been created. There is space for more. If I just summarize where I see the ecosystem right now and maybe 3 gaps that we probably need to address as a community. The first one is probably the need for co-literacy. The issues that we face are so complex that we need safe spaces, to engage, to understand what's behind the technologies. The real advantage of Silicon Valley somehow is that you have a lot of people who are developing the technologies themselves. So it's easier to get an inside glimpse into how technology really works. What are the opportunities? Also, what are the challenges? My second point is about safe spaces. I really feel that more than ever, there is a need for hallways of diplomacy to become a thing in the Bay Area. We know the importance of informal engagement in the diplomacy. And here in the Bay Area, you have just a few safe spaces that can bring different actors together. So creating more safe spaces is really the way to push the ecosystem further ahead. Maybe my last observation is that we really need to understand the need to bring a narrative and a practice that is not just Western. There is a great representation from Western state, and bringing nations from the South, as it was already mentioned, is really something that can already bring the conversation further away. Altogether, my sense is that we are a bit at a pivoting point. On the one side, you have a lot of efforts around block building, around regulation and so on, which are probably a response to the way the ecosystem is moving because of geopolitics. But more than ever, you need neutral spaces, you need safe spaces. And I'm really curious to knowing how we can make it happen to really ensure that tech diplomacy is not just about dialogues, but really about common action and systemic change.
Yeah, thank you so much for this overview. So co-literacy, safe spaces, being more inclusive. I think these are great points. I also remember in a previous conversation, you stressed the point that it's perhaps even dangerous to equate tech diplomacy too much with regulation, to kind of say regulation might be one of the conversations that takes place as part of tech diplomacy, but it's certainly not, from your experience and also from counterparts that you spoke to, perhaps not the main point, although obviously an important question that is on our minds, especially recently. So thank you for this overview. And we talked about, you mentioned even the word ecosystem, Yannick. And so I kind of want to hook into there because we often talk about tech diplomacy hubs. So the San Francisco Bay Area is a tech diplomacy hub. But at the same time, when we then turn to Geneva, for example, most decisions on global digital policy or the governance of digital technology are actually taken in Geneva. And Geneva is full of international organizations who focus on digital technology and kind of further the governance of digital technology. So one question, of course, is if we talk about the rise of the San Francisco Bay Area and the importance of diplomatic representation there, what does it mean for other digital or tech hubs like Geneva? And this brings me to Geneva, to Beatrice Ferrari. And I just, as a way of starting, I wanted to ask you how you experienced the practice of tech diplomacy in Geneva. And then also what I already alluded to, when we talk about the rise of tech diplomacy in the San Francisco Bay Area, what does it mean for Geneva? Does it mean Geneva becomes less important, or how would you respond to that? Over to you, Beatrice.
Thank you, Katharina. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your question. I think I would get back to what has been said before about the shift in the relationship between states and technology that is not focused on economy and innovation anymore, but is much more than that, especially when it comes to values, be it democracy, be it human rights, be it respect of the international human rights law, etc. So there is something that is more, so we can consider also being a representative here of a local government. We are not engaged directly in tech diplomacy, but we see it from Geneva as a kind of triangle where you would have states, you would have tech, but you would have also international organizations and NGOs. And it's true that in this context, Geneva is a huge ecosystem, is actually the largest center for international cooperation, where you can find all these different stakeholders, including a representation of states. So we are somehow a tech diplomacy center, as you mentioned, when it comes to setting norms, and part of the framing of the regulation that is happening here in Geneva. But there are more and more also interaction between NGOs, international organizations, and tech companies. Why? Because the use of technology can be useful. I mean, technology can be useful to reach different goals in development, in humanitarian aid, etc., but also to address the impact of technology, for example, on human rights, in conflict zone, on disinformation, etc. So this is why, as Yannick was mentioning, the ICRC, that different NGOs and international organizations have some representation already in the Bay Area to be close to those stakeholders, but there are some of those conversations also taking place here in Geneva on how we can get more responsible companies. And we are trying to foster a little bit that dimension, because we think that there is really something to do to strengthen this nexus between these really important tech stakeholders and other institutions that are working on global governance. To come back maybe on the safe space, there is something also here that we can offer in Geneva that is still more or less the neutral place where some difficult conversation can take place, not only on peace building, on cooperation, but including also for the tech and digital area.
Thank you so much for this overview. I think it's also really interesting to think about what different locations can offer. And I think one of the discussions I also take away from the tech diplomacy course that Diplo initiated and that is ongoing at the moment, and that I'm leading together with my colleague Pavlina Ittelson, there is basically one of the points on inclusiveness, and the feeling that we had in a discussion there that some of the discussions in tech diplomacy maybe should also take place in global diplomatic hubs where you have a more inclusive situation, a more broader representation of countries, such as Geneva, such as New York. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation, because it's a really interesting question of what different venues can offer in terms of tech diplomacy engagement. I want to come to our last speaker to round up our discussion. And for that, we're going to South Africa, to Tatu Moronkong. Tatu, I basically want to ask you a very similar question. How does tech diplomacy look like from your perspective? And also, what are the challenges in practicing tech diplomacy? And what I also have in my mind is what some of the other speakers have been alluding to, basically the question, the point that the Global South is extremely underrepresented when it comes to Silicon Valley, but there are a number of challenges to create this kind of inclusive dialogue. So yeah, over to you for the question, what does tech diplomacy look like from your perspective, being based in South Africa? And then perhaps also alluding to some of the challenges that you've seen in your work so far. Tato, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me, Katarina. I think this is a very dynamic panel, and over and above that, there is a lot that is being said that really differentiates the science diplomat with the technology diplomat. I think from this conversation, we are realizing that the technology diplomat really understands issues of investment, venture capitalism, angel investors, as well as the different market considerations. And it truly cannot just be a person that is solely working on science, technology, and innovation work, but they have to understand and have an idea really of the innovations as well as the technologies that can be adopted in the different markets and adapted, and provide really insights around how to sharpen their country's competitive edge, be it private or public. And I think I want to highlight a specific part of the report that we are discussing here that speaks to the issue that technology diplomacy is a mosaic of aspects of national policies derived from foreign policy, as well as other policies that may deal with other issues such as technology and digital aspects. And really, as we're discussing the Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, we think of a strong ecosystem, and this is something that was highlighted in, among others, the bioeconomy, bioindustrialization. And these places truly are not political hubs of the world as such, but we are seeing a rise in the posting of technology diplomats. And as such, as South Africa, what is done really is that we work through what we call science and technology attaches. what we do is that we identify strategic countries in science and technology, and this is done through the foreign policy mandate that we receive from our foreign ministry, which is the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And they then give us the sense of the opportunities that exist through which we then post science and technology attaches. The countries that are normally chosen are a balance between the West and the East, and we have quite a number of attaches that are posted and really entrench some of our partnerships, including the BRICS portfolio and many others. And then over and above that, we utilize the policy mechanisms that exist. And we have what we call the 2019 white paper, and as well as its recently approved by the South African Cabinet implementation plan called the Decadal Plan on Science, Technology and Innovation, which then advances the interface between science and economic diplomacy, a new area of focus with innovation featuring as a crucial element of South Africa's internationalization efforts. And really then the white paper proposes utilizing innovation and economic diplomacy as the conduits for driving industrialization and economic competitiveness, thereafter then contributing to some of the national priorities around advancing sustainable development, linking with the SDGs and many other imperatives. So as such, these policies then support that nexus between trade and innovation and technology and provide a significant shift really in science, South Africa's science and technology diplomacy to target development and the deployment of resources to support firms as well as technology SMEs in regional as well as global value chains, increasing competitiveness in areas such as manufacturing. And there are a number of also mechanisms that are utilized that support innovation in the technology space, such as the Innovation Fund, which supports many businesses, including SMEs that work in the technology space. And it speaks to supporting technology innovation and commercialization and high risk, especially technology development initiatives, such as the early development and expansion stages of businesses and technology-based South African startups specifically, including SMEs. And it's a new national financing instrument that is utilized between public as well as private sectors, and really de-risks early stage technology development phases. And as a result, this is then encouraging the ecosystem to stimulate economic development by deliberately de-risking early stage investment. So essentially, as such, technology diplomacy in South Africa becomes then a whole of government approach because it cuts across both the public, the private sector, as well as the NGO space, which is something that was highlighted previously. And the role players also then include a number of government sister departments as well as private sector players. And it really then emphasizes the quadruple helix approach of innovation, including collaboration between business, academia, government, and civil society. So essentially that is the approach. And I want to then wrap up to say that we cannot deal or handle or speak about technology diplomacy without looking at the potential mechanisms essentially to balance things out. And we have imperatives and policies such as the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects on Intellectual Property, which deals on IP. And if diplomacy does not become a platform for equitable access, then, we see that essentially technology will not then be taken up in foreign markets equitably. So that is my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this overview. Very, very much appreciated. I think what I take from your intervention is also the importance of having a strategy, the importance of coordinating across different government departments, and then this whole of government or like whole of society approach. I think a number of people, discussants here with us, would really underscore that as well. So thank you so much for that. I want to turn to my colleague Anastasia for an overview of what's been happening in the chat, and perhaps you can highlight one or two questions that we received so far. Over to you, Anna.
Yes, hello everyone. So one question from the online chat was, are there any capacity building trainings for policymakers in terms of tech diplomacy engagement? And also, how can countries address the digital divide and promote digital inclusivity through tech diplomacy?
Yeah, thank you so much for these two questions. Perhaps before I turn to our speakers for this first question, any capacity building opportunities. So one thing to highlight, of course, is the online course that Diplo started this year on tech diplomacy. The link is already in the chat here if you want to follow that up. For that course, we also collaborate with the Tech Diplomacy Network. But to add to that question for our speakers, I would also like to hear your views on what are the skills and the mindset or the knowledge that should be imparted when we talk about training and capacity building for tech diplomacy? Some of you are practitioners of tech diplomacy very specifically. So from your perspective, what kind of capacities should we build? What kind of training should we offer? What should be the content there? And then, of course, this very second important question on bridging the digital divide. So perhaps I would like to go in the same order as we started this conversation, and hear from each of you if you want to brief comments on these two questions, on capacity building training and on bridging the digital divide. So that would bring me first to Pavlina. How would you respond to these two questions?
Well, that is a very interesting question. So I'll start with the profile of the tech diplomat and what our findings have found in the report, and that is they're traditional diplomats, sometimes in the name, but never in a personality. They're usually very rounded up, well-rounded personalities, very often with dual or triple background, as we can see also in the room, who are able to evaluate the impacts of technology on societal issues, on economy, on employment, and they have a certain foresight. In order to do that, though, within the foreign policies, either digital or otherwise, or other policies that the countries implement, they do have a range of, let me put it, freedoms, maybe, in terms of how tech diplomacy is practiced and what it pursues. So you would have a tech diplomacy policy goals throughout certain policies on environment, on health, on economy, on employment, as I said, which are not defined as one package, but are basically dispersed throughout various policies. I think only Denmark so far has basically one document which defines what tech diplomacy is and how it should be pursued. That requires another skill from the tech diplomat, and that is being able to, within its own government, to cross the boundaries between different ministries and silos to discuss issues which are affected by technology and are within the realm of different ministries, for example. So yes, in terms of capacity building, as Katarina mentioned, I am not aware of other courses that would be available for tech diplomats. Practitioners can attest, who are in the room, that usually they are thrown to the lions then and left to figure it out in most cases by themselves, and it takes a certain skills which are not really tied to the education itself. But I would like to also point out that the capacity building in tech diplomacy is not only for tech diplomats. It should be also viewed from the side of the businesses. And the businesses also should be trained in tech diplomacy in terms of what is the benefit, why should they engage with foreign governments on tech issues, on their, for example, R&D issues, on how the technology they develop, either locally in San Francisco or elsewhere, impacts societal issues, impacts human rights, impacts democracy, or employment in 20 years, or how the children should be educated now so they can find jobs in 15 years and such. So it is, for now, the capacity building is in the early stages, I would say. I'm happy we have the course, and yeah, I think the link is in the chat. But in terms of capacity building, it needs to be also well-rounded for all the participants in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I think it's also a very important reminder that capacity building and tech diplomacy is also a question for tech companies, and to better prepare for that exchange. I want to turn to Martin. And Pavlina just mentioned many tech diplomats feel like they've been thrown into the lion's den or the cold water. Did you feel like that when you started?
Oh, absolutely. I think that Pavlina said it so well. It requires so many different skills that it almost really makes it very hard to point to a particular profile tech diplomats have. I would like to point to a traditional quality that diplomacy always required, which is to have this kind of bird's eye view and to be an all-rounder, a generalist in diplomacy in general, which is helpful. I think particularly now that so many of the impacts of technologies on society are now up to discussion, and not so much the technical knowledge itself, which of course you also require. So very often countries succeed when they manage to combine traditional diplomatic skills of the big global geopolitical perspectives and combine it with technological knowledge that is also, of course, needs to be very adaptive, because these technologies change very, very fast. I would also like to answer this question about access of more and more countries. And here I would like to also say to a certain change in countries' perspective on tech diplomacy was really started more kind of from an idea of competition also among countries that really wanted to succeed and promote their own companies, their own ecosystems. And this is, of course, still true to a certain extent, but it has been in some ways expanded to a much greater sense of collaboration among countries that are, for example, here in the Bay Area, that work together. And I would say that is also one of the approaches that countries that are not present or that are thinking of increasing their presence in the international fora of tech diplomacy could take, is working together with other countries. Regional approaches are often very helpful. Of course, European countries have traditionally worked together institutionally, also through the European Union that just last fall opened an office in San Francisco. But there are also other regions of the world that increasingly work together. Latin American countries increasingly work together. Asian countries work increasingly together. And that is then, of course, helpful to have this attitude of sharing best practices. We are all stronger together, and also, of course, working then together with private companies that also are more and more willing to open up, sharing their own perspectives, as it also benefits them.
Thank you so much for also this very practical ways of addressing the digital divide. Yannick, as another practitioner from the Silicon Valley ecosystem, how would you answer this question regarding capacity building skills, but perhaps also bridging the digital divide, bringing in countries from the global south?
If I look back at my time with the associacy, with Swissnex, and now with the consulate, if there is one thing that I felt from my engagement with the private sector, is that they care about a reading of the world that allows them to connect the dots differently. And somehow being able to share this reading of what's going on in the world, what is emerging, what is the next trend, is something that they value very much, not just in the technology sector, but in the private sector at large. So having this ability to compile analysis of trends, what is emerging from a government standpoint, is something that is usually a good basis for a dialogue. If I look at the skills you need internally within your government, somehow as a diplomat, as many of you have said before, it requires a non-traditional skill set where you value anticipation more than reporting. It's not just about reporting what is emerging and sending a report back to HQ, but you have to be able to anticipate more, and that requires a different skill sets. It requires also to talk to people who are at the border of innovation, who can understand what's coming up next. So you need to be able to talk to those people and fostering a relationship altogether. And maybe one minor point, which is something that I very much enjoyed within the Swissnex model, is that you also need to have this ability to innovate from an organizational standpoint. You know, Swissnex is an organization that was created by the Swiss Ministry of Education, not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And its funding structure is interesting because only a third of the budget comes from the government. The rest is there to be created through the interest of public and private partners. And that gives a bit of this flexibility to respond to whatever is emerging in the ecosystem. So being able to have a channel through which you can be flexible enough to offer something that is bendable as to respond to whatever issues or interest is emerging is, I think, what we need, you know, being innovative also when it comes to the institutions we create here in the Bay Area.
Thank you so much. So basically for diplomats, shifting from purely reporting to anticipation and a lot more contribution to foresight exercises. I think that's a really excellent point worth keeping in mind. I'm aware that Tato needs to leave a little bit earlier, so I want to turn to her first for a response to the question and then go to Beatrice. So Tato, how does it look like from your perspective?
Thank you so much. I think over and above what the colleagues have shared on this panel, we need to understand that technology diplomacy is truly the postmodern way of conducting diplomacy, and that the discourse around introducing technology and really moving from trade and the political work is then not necessarily meaning that political and economic diplomacy become obsolete, but they then become what anchors technology diplomacy. And as such, it is that understanding that at the end of the day, if you are a technology diplomat and you are posted it within whichever position that you hold, you are also there to also prioritize whichever region or whichever country that you represent and its interests. So it's understanding that it was mentioned that you need to be a generalist. You need to understand also the geopolitical space as well as it pertains to some of the political considerations that go into whether or not countries conduct a certain science or deploy a certain technology, etc. So it's really understanding that at the end of the day, these foreign missions also seek to leverage opportunities for their countries and as such operate within the bigger scheme of things, which is the political and the economic diplomatic relations and measures that are utilized to advance country priorities.
Thank you so much. I mean, I couldn't agree more. This kind of like emphasizing this broad understanding. I also like the fact that you equated tech diplomacy with a move into kind of a perhaps postmodern era in diplomacy. Very much appreciated. But now over to Beatrice in Geneva on these two questions: capacity building, training, and tech diplomacy. What skills would you highlight? And perhaps also this question of bridging the digital divide.
I think some of those questions. Sorry, I think some of those questions are valid also for different other topics. If we see here in Geneva topics that are quite complex, like health issues at the global level, for example, we see that diplomats and especially permanent mission here have very few people, especially some countries that can't afford to have too many people. So they don't have also the resources really to follow all these issues and need to pool resources with other countries that it was mentioned before. So there is really a pooling apart from the capacity building that needs to be made. I think also that one of the important points is where are the spaces for conversation, because it's not only about finding a common language to address each other and understand what is happening in the tech industry and vice versa for the tech business to understand what happens in the diplomatic sphere, but it's really where do you place those conversations? Are those bilateral efforts from each state to address those companies? Are the spaces where those conversations can take place with different countries around the table, different organizations? So it's really also about finding these right spaces that I feel today we lack somehow, or we do not have enough. And perhaps the last point is really this nexus today, either for the companies but also for the diplomat to work around these three points of anticipation, regulation, and responsibility. And where do you place do you place one another in these connections, and where you can open conversation between these different dimensions. So it's really a way, as it was mentioned, also to rethink the role of the diplomat, but also to encourage the other stakeholders to open this conversation.
Thank you. And I now really imagine this triangle between regulation, responsibility, and, oh God, I just forgot the third one. Regulation, responsibility. Anticipation. Yeah. A really, really great image in my mind now. And that actually brings me to my next question, because we highlighted that so tech diplomacy might not be a new practice, but it has emerged out of the crisis moment, out of the question that tech companies have a huge impact around the world, and therefore there needs to be this kind of dialogue. And this dialogue and negotiation is emphasized a lot. And then we say, okay, it's not just between countries and tech companies, but broader. And it's about really, really serious topics. Pavlina mentioned human rights in the beginning. You mentioned a number of other topics that have become very crucial under the umbrella of tech diplomacy, for example, as these dialogues and discussions are taking place in Silicon Valley. But what I'm still wondering is, how do we have these kind of conversations? Because obviously this takes place, from what we've been talking about so far, in a lot of cases in very informal frameworks, in conversations between tech companies and diplomats, but about very pressing, very important issues. So what is the how? So for example, coming back to Martin, I know that through Open Austria and through his position as the tech ambassador, an approach called cultural tech diplomacy has been tried out and has been implemented as another way of having these kind of conversations. So basically my question, in particular for Yannick and Martin, but others feel free to come in, is how do you have these kinds of conversations, which are very crucial about difficult topics, usually in informal settings? Any experience you want to share, and like, how do we have to imagine what is actually going on there? Perhaps Martin, you can start. I see you're already unmuted. Go ahead.
Yes, I think that the question is correct. This is kind of something that every tech diplomat has to answer for themselves. Where do these conversations take place, and with whom do they take place? Because it's probably when you have a big company, it's not always going to be the same person. You mentioned kind of also cultural diplomacy or cultural tech diplomacy as being one avenue. Of course, that is opens up if you talk about artistic projects or projects of philosophers, thinkers, representatives from the humanities. Then you can talk with different people, and you talk also about you kind of come up with a different approach towards tech companies than if you only talk about regulations. So there are different avenues. There are also areas where you can talk about, for example, digital human rights, where there is a commonality often of interests, and at least of values, where you find common grounds and where you can talk, openly about certain problems that arise in different corners of the world, and you can talk about them openly. And sometimes you can also talk about something that I think has become a main kind of theme in tech diplomacy. You can talk about unintended consequences. So it's not often the case that your intentions really, whether you're a tech company, whether you are a civil society organization, or whether you're a nation state, that your intentions always really work out the way you thought they would. And talking about these kind of unintended consequences that regulations might have, that different actions might have, and when you then talk about how citizens are affected, how other countries are affected, those are the kind of things that are the substance often of tech diplomacy talks, and they can really then benefit all actors in the field.
Thank you so much. Yannick, what's your response to this question of how do I have to imagine these tech diplomacy interactions in San Francisco?
One thing that we've seen, as it was mentioned before, is that they cluster around a few important issues. Human rights, you said, there is a few other topics that are important. The one key observation on my side is that you have a lot of tech diplomats within the private sector as well. People who either used to work in the governments, or people who are familiar with those issues because they are experts. They've done some research on the topic with a university and so on. So there is a lot of expertise on the other side as well. So if you want to really cultivate strategic relationships, the best way forward there is to create a community and think about what rituals can you put in place to bring people together on regular basis, ensuring that people get to know each other, because as they get to know each other, that fosters trust, that fosters mutual understanding. I will always remember this conversation we had. I think it was part of the report consultations, where you had a few of the professionals from technology companies who said that in some cases they escalate directly together as a community of a practice. Say the people who work in a trust and safety, they are not waiting for instructions to come from the top, but very often they know each other and they just align directly with each other. So that says a lot about also the value of those safe spaces. And for us, it's so important as governments to understand the value of fostering a community of a practice and creating rituals that will bring those stakeholders together over and over again.
Thank you so much. And Pavlina, I think you also wanted to come in with reflections coming out of the research from the report.
Yes, and they also relate to what we spoke about today, and especially what Beatrice was saying. San Francisco, and I understand there are other hubs of tech diplomacy around the world, but talking about San Francisco and Geneva in particular, San Francisco has emerging policy discussions. So there are clusters of like-minded countries which discuss certain policy impacts and issues. On the other side, Geneva has the policy issues which could benefit from the tech diplomacy input. And my question is mainly to everybody who's present, and maybe a bit of a rhetoric one, is how do we translate the benefits of tech diplomacy, the benefits of that anticipation of understanding what comes next in technology into the policy making on international level? I mean, we have not spoken about the UN Tech Envoy yet, and the Global Digital Compact and the ability of basically all stakeholders to put input into that conversation. And also within the international organizations involved, where I see we have ICRC in the room as well, how do we translate the impacts which are seen in tech diplomacy hubs into policy making, and how we make actually the evidence-based policy making on international level more rounded, more complete, more I would say future resistant in a sense of technology development. So that would be my reflection, but there's certainly a lot of benefits which are and efforts on the sides of countries and companies which could be well harvested in these spaces. So that's just a reflection on that one.
Thank you so much. I think a really, really great reminder also about the initiatives going on at the multilateral level, at the UN level. Very much appreciated. Beatrice, perhaps, do you have any reflections from the Geneva ecosystem on having these kinds of multi-stakeholder dialogues, perhaps also what Pavlina just mentioned, having these informal spaces and conversations that then feed into actual policy making? Any advice or any reflections from your side, also because Pavlina just mentioned the global UN processes, so it would be interesting to hear how this looks like from the Geneva perspective.
Yeah, so I think that there are different streams of discussion that are ongoing. So one stream of discussion is it's already a conversation that is open and bringing around the table also some of the tech industry on how to collaborate. But the experience is also that every time we want to put different kind of stakeholders around the table, it needs time also to find a common language, right? That comes back to the discussion about skills. It's how do we understand each other before even doing something together, but really how do we understand and find a common language? We see that, I just take the example in Geneva about sustainable finance, how to bring around the table people from the finance industry, banking, etc., with stakeholders from the development area and find, concrete ways to collaborate. So it takes time. It needs some steps, but I think it is possible. The other way is how you bring anticipation into policy making, and that is also something that an organization in Geneva is trying to do. The Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, really, again, to transform anticipation in something that is understandable. If we are doing foresight, what does it mean today? And then finding ways, and again, it's kind of difficult to find ways to translate that concretely into policy. And then I would say that the third stream of interaction that are ongoing are concrete projects about issues that one or the other organization can encounter democratic processes and the role of social media, for example. There are several NGOs here in Geneva that are concretely working on these issues and engaging with tech leaders, because they have also a responsibility to take in those kind of processes. So you can also find a common language once you see also a common interest, and really try to advance on these issues. And there are also other projects at the bigger scales that are trying to bringing together the tech industry and the development, especially projects that are also led by the UN.
Thank you so much. I mean, just to add, from our personal experience at Diplo, it is sometimes not even that easy to bring multiple stakeholders to the same conversation, to really show the value of that conversation, and to, for example, bring the tech companies into the room, and perhaps not just one person, to have these kind of conversations. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of like building up to show the value of the conversation, and then, as you said, translated hopefully into something practical. We're almost at the end of our discussion. So since I don't see any other pressing questions in the chat, and my colleague Anna just confirmed that, perhaps let's have a final round with our speakers for a very final reflection, perhaps on the future of tech diplomacy, any pressing issues you would highlight, anything you would leave us with in terms of thoughts and ideas to continue this conversation. I will have to go in the same order as we started. So this will bring me to Pavlina, then Martin, then Yannick, and last but not least, Beatrice. Pavlina, final words from you.
Well, it's kind of hard to predict tech diplomacy future, but it is here to stay. I do believe it's gonna gain more momentum in terms of digital foreign policy and be more embedded in the policies throughout the governments, whether through global digital ambassadors or tech envoys in the local places. In terms of our work, we will try to map more of the tech diplomacy hubs in the future. That is the plan, but for now, we will very much concentrate on the tech diplomacy course, right, Katarina? So we can basically build the capacities, as we discussed, for the diplomats to engage in these conversations.
Yes, I agree with Pavlina. Tech diplomacy is here to stay. Some of the topics we are discussing right now in the Tech Diplomacy Network, we are going to have next week a discussion on generative AI. Of course, everybody is discussing it, and we will talk about the possibility of creating international mechanisms to coordinate and regulate generative AI, because this is a debate that is going on in the public. We will I think also have more discussions on technologies where we don't really see their impact already, but we know that there will be important impact, like quantum computing is, I think, on the minds of many governments and of also many tech diplomats. And I think also there will be, with advances in biotechnology, there will be also important discussions in the future in this field.
Maybe on my side, one key observation is that somehow the way geopolitics is influencing many discussions requires somehow new approaches that are maybe going down from the meta level, the micro level, to the individual level. And one great opportunity that we currently have is a collaboration that the Swiss government has with the SRC through the Digital Dilemma exhibition that was showed in New York a few weeks ago. And it shows what is the experience that civilian populations living in armed conflict have whenever they use the technologies. And it brings the conversation down to individual experiences. And that's really one thing I hope for the future of the Bay Area, is that it really moves away from just talking about meta trends, but that it really understands the complexity of their impact and the intended and unintended consequences of the technology they create on the people who live in the South, on the people who live in the midst of armed conflict. Also, because the solutions that are developed that could work in those environments, they can be scalable across the world. So I think such a discussion about civilian people living in conflict zones can not just be interesting from an from an intellectual standpoint for the private sector, but also be a very resilient way to build the technology so that it leaves nobody behind, but truly serves people.
Yeah, from my side, I would really come back on the notion of inclusivity. I think it has been mentioned, the importance of also the representation of states, especially from the South. But it's not only about that. I think it's really the way of putting different people around the table, including also the civil society, which is really key, and also the diversity of businesses, because we are talking about the Silicon Valley, but the major tech companies are not only in the Bay Area nor in the US in general, but also in different other parts of the world. And geopolitics, to come back on what Yannick was saying, is showing its power right now, and the difficulty also to address some key issues, because obviously companies are also based in countries that have difficulties to talk to each other. So really addressing tech diplomacy in China, in other parts of the world where it is happening, will be really the key, I think.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to add anything to these wonderful insights from our speakers. Thank you so much. You leave us with much food for thought, and also much appreciation I'm seeing in the chat for this insightful discussion. And as you highlighted, tech diplomacy is here to stay. And it's going to be really interesting to see how it shapeshifts and develops in the future. The topic is obviously more than important, and it is just going to continue to be so. From my side, the only thing I would like to do is to thank our speakers for taking the time to join us, especially for those in San Francisco who joined us very early in the morning. Really very much appreciated. Thank you for sharing your insights, for bringing all these different perspectives to the discussion, and for giving us a good basis to continue our thinking and conversations on tech diplomacy. For everyone who joined us today, thank you for joining us. As usual, we follow up with the recording of this debate and with the summary. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, thank you for joining us today, and let's continue the conversation online.